So tonight we're going to continue with God's amazing people. To prepare, I've gone back and listened to every lesson, and they've all been amazing. Brother Paul's message on Elijah. Elijah's my favorite Bible story ever. My kids ask me all the time. They get the same answer. I don't know why they keep asking, but that's what they're looking forward to. They like to ask questions about that, and I love that they do that. So Elijah was my favorite story. I'm not going to talk about Elijah, so don't worry. We're not going to rehash that. And I'm actually really impressed. Bishop preached on 3 people last week in 50 minutes, and Abraham was one of them. It takes me 50 minutes to read the first chapter of Genesis. No. So that's really awesome. But tonight, I am going to talk about Elisha. Elisha is my second favorite character. No, not really. But what I did find out is I think I give too much credit to Elijah and not enough credit to Elisha. And tonight, I think as we go through this, you guys will see some of the same things. So Elisha is the successor to Elijah. I don't know why they have the same name. Super confusing. Elijah, Elisha. Hopefully I don't make that mistake. But Elijah's the man that was taken away to heaven in a whirlwind in a chariot of fire. He was fed by ravens. He held back rain. He talked to Ahab. He was a wanted man, a very unusual lifestyle. He's definitely one of the greats. They talk about him in Hebrews. We see him on the Mount of Transfiguration. Peter wants to build an altar to him. But the man that's named the successor to Elijah is Elisha. Elisha, the first time we hear about Elisha, he's actually mentioned by God, and it comes at Elijah's lowest point in his life. Elijah, he has the mountaintop experience of Mount Carmel. He calls down rain afterwards, and then something happens in his life. Jezebel hears about it. They send people after him. There's a price on his head, and he gets really depressed. He comes to this point where he's really low, and he's telling God that he's ready to call it quits. He's done. There's nothing else to do. And it's in this moment that God sustains him. He sees other miracles happen that God points him to this man named Elisha. And so Elisha comes into the life of Elijah, and just a few highlights here about the life of Elisha. So Elisha and Elijah, this takes place in the 9th century BC. So Israel at this time, they're totally given to idolatry. They've turned away from God. Most of this is because of the rule of Ahab and Jezebel. They're following a god called Baal. Baal is also known as the god of rain and dew, so you can make some connections there between what Elijah and God spoke and what they expected. They expected rain, and they didn't see how this was going to work out. But that's one of the great things about God. God knows how to speak exactly to the problem that they're facing in that moment. And man, it just totally blows me away when you read through these things, the things that God just kind of reveals to you as you're going. So Ahab and Jezebel wanted Elijah killed, and then that would mean that if Elisha is going to follow Elijah, he could probably expect some of the same things to happen. We first hear about Elisha in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 16. Prior to his calling, Elisha's a farmer. It's not exactly what you would expect for the successor to the greatest prophet of Israel. You would have expected maybe one of the 700 that hadn't bowed their knee to Baal. But it's a farmer that God calls. That's good news for us, because that means any of us can be used to God. We don't already have to have it all together. We don't already have to understand it. It's just so awesome to me. All right, some scholars actually believe that Elisha came from a wealthy family. We'll talk a little bit about that. Others think that he might have been helping with other oxen. We'll talk a little bit about that too. So when Elijah came to cast his mantle, Elisha responds. He goes. He doesn't wait. There's no hesitation. He's ready to go. And Elisha and Elijah, they traveled and ministered together. Most people say it's about 10 years before Elisha's ministry actually begins. Part of his time is under the tutelage and mentorship of Elijah. He's learning about Elijah's life. He's learning about the experiences from Elijah's perspective, and he's learning about God. He's learning about how God sustains, how God meets the needs of the people around him, and he's getting this great information, this great knowledge, and he's preparing for what's coming next. Most of Elisha's miracles were works of healings and restoration. This is a confusing thing. If you read, I think there's a problem with defining what a miracle is. I read that there are anywhere from 38 to 14 miracles, and they're always double whatever they give to Elijah. So I'm not going to give you a number. I will tell you that the one thing that everybody seems to agree on is that Elisha did more miracles than everybody except for Jesus. Jesus is the only person that has more miracles associated with him than Elisha. So there's not a whole lot known about the early life of Elisha. It's kind of like Elijah. He just shows up one day and nobody really knows what. All we know about Elijah is he's a Tishbite. We don't know who his dad is. We don't know what led to his relationship with God. We don't know what his childhood was like. We don't know what his favorite foods were. We don't know if he had any pets. We don't know any of these things. We don't know what his mom taught him. We don't know any of these things. We don't know what schools he went to or if he went to school or what he did before he was called to be a prophet. With Elisha, we get a little more information. Elisha, we find out that he's the son of Shaphat. He was a farmer, and we can read about this in 1 Kings chapter 19. It says, "So he departed thence and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed by him and cast his mantle upon him. And he left the oxen and ran after Elijah. And he said, 'Let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow thee.' And he said unto them, 'Go back again, for what have I done to thee?' And he returned back from him and took a yoke of oxen and slew them and boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen and gave unto the people, and they did eat. Then he arose and went after Elijah and ministered unto him." So this is an interesting starting point for a new prophet. But there's some really cool things that I learned by reading through this and things that I just picked up on. So Elisha, the first thing I noticed is Elisha's out working the field. He's not waiting on a greater calling. He's doing what he's called to do right now. He's plowing. He's got 12 oxen. I think that totally blows my mind too. 12 oxen back then seems like an awful lot. But when Elijah cast his mantle, everything changes for Elisha. It comes to a point where he has to make a decision about what he's going to do next. I think one of the great things too about Elisha is that he doesn't mention any limitations. I don't know how many times when we read about people being called by God that they talk about the things that limits them from going where God's calling them. I mean, Moses, the guy that was raised a prince in Egypt, he was raised with military leadership. He was raised with their education system. The first thing he tells God is he's got a stuttering problem. He can't talk anymore. I need help. I can't do this. You should have called me 40 years earlier. I was ready then. We get that. You hear Gideon. Gideon talks about being the smallest from the least of his family. He's not confident in what God's calling him to do. Elisha, though, he doesn't mention any of his limitations. He doesn't talk about how he's busy. He doesn't talk about how he has all this farm to plow. He doesn't talk about any of those things. As a matter of fact, he doesn't hesitate at all. He simply submits to Elijah. He gets to the point where he even asks permission to go tell his family goodbye. That's how committed he was in that moment, that he had to ask if he could go say goodbye to the family he had been with. And then he does this other really crazy thing, I think. He takes the tools, creates a fire with the tools, and then he burns the oxen, cooks them up, serves it to his friends, and then he leaves. So let's break it down a little bit. Elijah is well known because he did mighty works. Everybody's going to know about the story on Mount Carmel. They're going to know about the fire that fell. They're going to know how God came down, licked up the water out of the trenches, burned up all the sacrifices, and Elijah runs off, and then he goes and starts praying for rain, and they're going to hear about how it didn't rain until Elijah prayed for it, and then he outran the chariot, and he's going to hear about these things. But he's also going to hear that Elijah is a wanted man now. Jezebel sent armies after him. He's not exactly the kind of guy that you want to go throw your hat in the ring with. You think he's on a farm, he's got 12 oxen, he's pretty safe where he's at. There's not going to be a reason to leave. And if he goes with Elijah, like Jezebel's got an army after him. That's a pretty scary thought, in my opinion. I mean, so many of us don't want to leave our houses sometimes because, like, there's traffic, somebody might see us. Yes, these are real things I've heard. Not today, though, not today. So Elisha probably would have realized that if he agreed to follow Elijah, that he'd be facing the same thing. And he would probably realize that he was going to be used to God, but the world may hate him. I mean, it's not exactly popular being the guy that makes it stop raining. So I mentioned this before, but there are many indications that Elisha came from a wealthy family. All right, first, they gave his dad a name. Like, they mentioned the name. Most people don't get a name mentioned unless there's something important about them. The second thing is he's got 12 oxen, 12 teams of oxen. I'm not going to let it go. With the 12 teams of oxen, he's out there working. And like, there's the theory that maybe he was taking them, but then he kills them. So I don't think there's somebody else's oxen, especially since he goes through a lot of trouble to pull an axe head out of the water later on. So there's a chance that he's wealthy. And that means that if he decides to go on this route, that he's going to be leaving behind a pretty big inheritance. He's going to be leaving behind money. He's going to be leaving behind security. And he's going to be leaving a life of comfort to go follow Elijah, to possibly end up in prison or dead. But Elisha's not like a lot of people. Elisha chose to submit to the call of God. For him, the call that God placed in his life was greater than the cost. Elisha's first response to Elijah, that's a lot of eyes. I should just call him Eli. Elisha was to request permission to say goodbye. That's his first request. The only other time, like, I see this is in the New Testament. So when Jesus was calling a man to follow him, there was a man that said that he needed to go back and say goodbye to his family. But in Elisha's case, it's different because he's asking to say goodbye to his old life and to enter into the calling that God has for him. It's not a delay, it's him closing the door. So then comes the celebratory meal of oxen and the plow. This was not a delay either. When Elisha cooked the oxen with the plows, he was saying goodbye to his old life for good. He did not want to stay there. He didn't want to be tempted to return. I think sometimes what happens in our lives is that we like to leave a door open, the just in case in our lives. We want to know that if this doesn't work out the way we think it's going to, that we have a way to go back to it. And sometimes it's not bad. Sometimes it's just we want to be entertained. It's just a security blanket. But sometimes it's bad things that we need to let go of. So if we're going to walk that kind of life, if we're going to walk in what God's called us to, maybe we need to take some advice from Elisha and burn the oxen. So this calling of Elisha ends with Elisha ministering to Elijah. I thought this was important because if you look at where Elijah came from, he came from this moment of despair. And God said, I need you to go anoint Elisha. I need you to go find him. I need him to go with you. And the first thing his first action after asking for requests is to minister to Elijah. You got to think about the life of Elijah. He had been out in the wilderness. He had been fed by ravens. I mean, he spent a lot of time alone. So for him to have a friend, somebody that he could relate to, someone he could pour into, someone he could share a life with, was a big deal. What he was gaining, he wasn't gaining somebody to pour into alone, but he was also getting a friend. So there are two things I think we can take away from his calling. The first, don't get excited. We're not getting out that early. There are two things we can take away from this calling. The first is that if we want to be committed to the call of God in our lives, Elisha was working in the field before God called him to something different. So we got to be committed to the things that God's calling us to today before we can look to the greater things that God has for us. God's not going to call you to do something greater if you're not doing what you already know to do today. When God called him to something different, though, he was ready to go all in. He got rid of the old life and he moved forward with the new. And not only did he get rid of it, he cut all ties with it. There was no way he was going back to it. There was nothing to come back to for him. He was going all in with God or he wasn't going to go at all. There was nothing to return to. He didn't take his old life with him. He didn't take the oxen and the plows with him. He didn't do that so they could go farm in his new land. He didn't do any of those things. He left it behind. And he burned it so he couldn't come back to it. What we can learn from Elisha is that we do not need our old lives. When we set out to live for God, God's got something greater for us. It's not the old life that we need. He's calling us to something different. And when he calls you to something different, he's going to equip you, one, and he's going to make it greater than what you can imagine. It may not look what you think it's going to look like, but it's always going to be greater than where you came from. I don't say this to make it a call to quit your job or to leave families or anything like that, but it's a call to look at things that are keeping you from doing what God is calling you to do. It could be a job. It could be some past hurts. It could be unforgiveness. It can be bitterness, maybe fear, anxiety, some addictions. But if we're going to move forward with God, we're going to have to leave some things behind. Whatever it is that's holding us captive, whatever is holding us in this moment, those are the things that we need to look at and let go of. The other thing I took away from this is the power of fellowship. I've spent the last 3.5 years in Purpose Institute, and one of the things that sticks with me right now is the need for a friend. We all need friends. We're not meant to be alone. That's why God created Eve for Adam. There wasn't anything there was no animal that was going to be that kind of support for him. There was no one to have that conversation with. We're made for one another. We're made to build each other up. We're made to be united in prayer with one another. Jesus talks about the power of united prayer in Matthew 18 and 20. No matter what function you have in the kingdom, no matter how great or how small you think you are, or you are, you need a friend. And it's important for us to come together for worship. It's important for us to be a part of small groups. It's important for us to pray together. We got to have fellowship, and God shows us that through this encounter with Elisha and Elijah. He wouldn't give Elisha if it wasn't necessary. All right, 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 9 through 14. And it came to pass, when they were gone over, that Elijah said unto Elisha, ask what I shall do for thee, because I will be taken away from thee, or before I be taken away from thee. And Elisha said, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. And he said, thou hast asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if thou see me when I am taken away from thee, it shall be done unto thee. But if not, it shall not be so. And it came to pass, as they still went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven, and Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more, and he took hold of his own clothes, and rent them in 2 pieces. He took up also the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and went back and stood by the bank of Jordan. And he took the mantle of Elijah and fell from him, and smote the waters, and said, where is the God of Elijah? And when he also had smitten the waters, they parted hither and thither, and Elisha went over. All right, so coming into this chapter, 2 Kings chapter 2, there's been a lot of times past. The last time we hear about Elisha is his calling. There's no mention of him in the first chapters, or the first chapter of 2 Kings, or the last chapters of First Kings. Most people say this has been about a 10-year span. What we do see here is that Elisha is still walking with Elijah. What we can also assume is that this has been time where they spent in discipleship. So Elijah was pouring into the life of Elisha. He was a disciple making a disciple. I think we've heard this. During this time, Elijah's telling him all about the experiences of his life. He's telling Elisha about what it was like to be fed by ravens. He's telling him what it's like to call down fire from heaven. Probably even talking about how he kept pestering the Baal believers. He was like, where's your God? Maybe he's sleeping. Is he taking a nap? Why don't you call? Maybe he's hard of hearing. Maybe you got to cry louder. He's on vacation. So you get this idea that he started pouring in, not just his experience, not just what he's seen about God, but he's sharing his life with them. And all this time, Elisha is taking all this in. It's starting to shape and form the person he's going to become. And in 2 Kings chapter 2, this is the end of Elijah's ministry, and it really starts off the ministry of Elisha. So Elijah lived out the mission that we have here in CT, disciples making disciples. That's our goal, that's our mission, that's what we're here to do. We need good examples of that. Elijah was willing to share his life with Elisha, tell his stories, and build his faith by telling him these things. If we're going to continue to grow, we need to do the same things. We need to continue to pour into one another. We need a friend. We need someone that we're going to share life with. We need someone that we can rely on to pray for one another. We all have needs. And I don't know what it is about us as people, but I don't know why we don't want to share our needs with people. We've got to do a better job about talking about the things that we're really dealing with. We need someone that we can tell everything. I mean, Elisha and Elijah spent 10 years together. I doubt there's very much they didn't know about each other. I'm sure Elisha could tell from the moment they got up whether or not Elijah was going to have a good day or a bad day. And the same was probably true of Elijah. He could tell when Elisha got up whether or not any of the things he told him were going to stick or not. I mean, we can tell it in our own families. We know when to wake people up, when not to. We know when to bring up a conversation and when not to. We can do this. We can make disciples that make disciples. We all have a story. We've got to be willing to tell that story. There are some amazing testimonies in the Bible, but there are amazing testimonies in this room. And the only thing that's going to change people's lives is if they see that God can do it. So let's talk about some of the faith-building things that Elijah probably shared with Elisha. So we do find a fellowship. We do find out there's a school of prophets. We get to hear about how he confronted kings under the anointing of God. I mean, it's pretty scary to think that Ahab, who has nothing to do with God at all, he's going to go tell him it's not going to rain. Then he's going to go tell him, hey, I want you to call up all the prophets of Baal and have them meet me on Mount Carmel. I got a little game for them. And then he goes and tells him it's going to rain again. And he tells him all the things that God shares with him about how their family is going to progress, what's going to happen to future generations. I think that's another amazing thing about the Old Testament is that so many of our past forefathers, they cared so much about not just their lives, but the lives of future generations. That's something we got to get into our spirits as well. So Elisha and Elijah, they both got to walk on ground where waters had parted. He got to understand what it was like to be lonely like Elijah. He get to relive out that story. He get to hear about what it felt like when he stepped out of that cave and God sent the fire and the earthquake and then hear the small voice. And he got to hear it. And you can't hear stories like that without it changing your life. He also got to find out how God responds and how he gives him strength and support to continue. And Elisha takes it all in, and he gets to see how God answers prayers. He gets to hear how God will send rain at the sound of Elijah's voice. He knows that God is listening. He knows that all these things are happening, and it starts to shape him and mold him into what God is calling him to. It's awesome. And the other thing that he learns is that he can't do it alone. like he can't go into ministry by himself. He knows that he needs something greater. He knows that he needs God. Because everything that Elijah is given credit for, all he did was do what God asked him to do. And then he spoke to God, and God did what he asked. It's amazing what God is doing. What God's looking for are willing vessels. So with the request for the double portion of Elijah's spirit, when you read this, a lot of people want to try to make it about the number of the miracles. And I think that's one way to look at it. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. But I think what's really important here is that Elisha is realizing that what he needs is the anointing that God had on the life of Elijah if he's going to continue. He needed God. He knew there were gaps in his life. He looked at what was left. He looked at the state of Israel. He realized that if they were going to reach and finish the mission that God had called them to do, that he was going to have that anointing. He was going to have God go with him to fill the gaps. He knew that he was weak. He needed God's strength to fill in that gap where he was weak. He needed knowledge and wisdom where he lacked. He knew it was not about doing greater in quality, but it was about being equipped to walk in the calling that God had for him. Elisha had the heart of a servant. He wasn't looking to be greater. He only desired to have God be glorified and that God be with him. He wanted to live out the calling that God had on his life. So let's look at the ministry of Elisha. The ministry of Elisha, Purpose Institute does this great thing when they do character studies. They want to try to sum it up with a word or a phrase to say, this is the summary of the ministry. This is what it was all about. I came up with my own. You're welcome. So the key for the life of Elisha is that God is greater. Now, the double portion thing throws people off. They think, oh man, look at the miracles that Elisha did. But if you really look at what Elisha talks about, the way Elisha works, it's very different than that. The first act that he had was to serve Elijah. First thing that he did after he got permission, after he said goodbye, was to minister to Elijah. And what he asked for was a double portion of the anointing. He wanted to pick up in that ministry that God had called him to. He wanted to pick up and go and do all the things that God had laid on his heart, but also the burden he picked up when Elijah was carried away. Their ministry is one, it's a continuation. It's probably a good way to look at ministry as a whole, is that it's not just us. We're doing something greater here. I mean, if you look at what we're doing in this church right now, what we're seeing as far as miracles go, and the signs and the wonders and the growth, these are prayers that were prayed years ago. We're not talking about prayers that we're praying right in this moment. Those prayers, some of them may be taking place now, but some of those prayers we won't see for years, guys. That's what's happening. That's what we need. We need people that are going to invest in that. So what we find out about God is greater. What does it matter? What is it looking for? What do we see in the life of Elisha? So God was greater than Elijah's despair. He gave him a disciple, and Elisha gave him a friend. God was greater than Baal. Baal was the god of rain and dew, and God stopped the rain and the dew for over 3 years. And God said it's not going to happen again until I tell you it's going to. And then God's greater than Elijah's enemies. He promised that Ahab and Jezebel would see their demise in their future generations, and he did it. God was bigger than Elisha's insecurities. After he saw Elijah called up to heaven and he smote the waters of the Jordan and walked on dry ground, Elisha realized then that he had the anointing and that what he needed, that God that was greater, was with him. He was equipped. He was ready to go. God was greater than just a single miracle through the life of Elisha. I honestly think Elisha could have gone through and ministered with just being able to cross the Jordan because he knew that God was with him in that moment. But Elisha's life is actually full of different miracles that are accounted towards him. We talk, here's a list of 11. I'm not going to say it's all of them. He makes the Jericho spring drinkable. He sends bears to punish irreverent youths. Sounds like a strange story. It is. He floods ditches to give water to Israel and confuse the Moabites. He multiplies the widow's oil. He prophesies that the Shunammite woman will give birth to a son. Another story kind of like in Abraham. And then when the son dies, he resurrects the Shunammite son. He purifies a poisoned stew. He heals Naaman's leprosy. He floats the lost axe head. He gives a special sight to the king's messenger. And he blinds the Aramean army. So if we were to talk through each of these events, we would see that in many cases when God moved, that they received more than what they requested. This is an awesome thing about the story of Elisha. When you look, they come with a specific need, but God says, I give you this, and he doesn't stop with what they ask for. God is greater than the need. And man, I don't think you can live through that without getting it in your spirit to expect it again and again. You kind of start to smile when people come to bring a need, and then God starts to speak to you, and then you wait for it. And that, man, that gets me. I promised I would sit still. So what we see is that even a lot of times Elisha will step away and then he will just give the direction and let God give the results. Like Elisha's not even in the room when the oil is being poured. He knew that God was greater. He knew that all he had to do was give the direction. He's like, if you do this, this will happen. And I think this helps add some perspective to this account near the end of Elisha's life. So in 2 Kings chapter 13, verses 14 through 19, it says, Now Elisha was fallen sick of his sickness, whereof he died. And Joash, the king of Israel, came down unto him and wept over his face and said, O my father, the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof. And Elisha said unto him, Take bow and arrows. And he took unto him bow and arrows. And he said unto the king of Israel, Put thine hand upon the bow. And he put his hand upon it, and Elisha put his hands upon the king's hands. And he said, Open the window eastward. And he opened it. Then Elisha said, Shoot. And he shot. And he said, The arrow of the Lord's deliverance, and the arrow of the deliverance from Syria. For thou shalt smite the Syrians in Aphek, till thou have consumed them. And he said, Take the arrows. And he took them. And he said unto the king of Israel, Smite upon the ground. And he smote thrice and stayed. And the man of God was wroth with him. And he said, Thou shouldest have smitten 5 or 6 times. Then hadst thou smitten Syria until thou hadst consumed it. Whereas now thou shalt smite Syria but thrice. Okay, so what does it mean? When you look at this story at the end of Elisha's life, what you see is that Elisha was expecting more. Joash wasn't there, but if Joash had asked Elisha, he would have told him about the accounts that he had seen. He would have told him that there's something greater. Don't give up, don't stop until you see what's coming. So the king came to honor him, but Elisha wanted to give him something more. He wanted to give him more than just one victory. He wanted to give him an overcoming victory, one that would last a lifetime. Joash strikes the ground 3 times, and Elisha becomes frustrated because he said, if you could have just kept going, if you would have known what was on the other side, if you would have kept knocking on that door, if you would have known what was on the other side of it, you wouldn't have stopped. There was victory. What he really wanted him to see is, like, if you would just ask, if you would just listen. And I think if we could just kind of imagine what it was like for Elisha to relive those moments, what he was thinking when he was going through it. Like when the widow came to him, she would say, Elisha, my husband's dead. He loved God, he's gone, you know him, you know the life he lived, and now there are people at my door and they're here to take away my sons. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't have money. I don't want them to go. If they go, no one's going to be able to take care of me. I've got nothing except this pot of oil. So Elijah gives the instructions. He says, go and get more pots, and not just a few. See, if Joash had asked, he would have known not to stop too soon. He could have Googled it, asked what a few means, and kept going. But then he says, this is the weird part about Elisha. Elisha doesn't even want to be in the room. He said, close the door, you and your sons, and pour the oil. And she pours. She goes, they get the vessels, they go to neighbors, they gather them all. They got a house full of these empty pots. She shuts the door. She starts pouring the oil. She pours and she pours. And then she gets to the point where she fills up the last one that's near her and she asks for another. There's nothing left. They're all gone. It's full. The living room's full. The house is full. There are these pots of oil. And that's all she knows to do. She isn't given any more instructions at this point. So she chases down Elisha. Elisha, there's oil. It's still there. There are tons of pots of oil in the house. I don't know what to do with it. Elisha says, he looks at her. He says, go, sell the pots of oil and pay your debts. She's excited now. She's got a way to pay for her debt. But God's not done. And Elisha finishes. He says, and live off the rest. God is greater than our need. And then he remembers Naaman coming to him. And then Elisha doesn't even want to go out and talk to Naaman. He sends his servant to greet him and gives him instructions. He says, go wash in the Jordan 7 times. Naaman, this great warrior, he's angry and doesn't want to do it, but his servants convince him. He's like, Naaman, if it were something great, you would already be out there. You would have gone to kill the bear and the lion and brought them both back. But because it's something simple, you don't want to do it. So they convince him, and he goes, and he dips in the 7th. He goes in the Jordan, he dips. Doesn't feel anything at first, but he keeps going. Maybe after like 5 times, he starts to feel something. Maybe some of the sores are gone. Maybe some new skin's coming. So he keeps going. He finishes with the 7th washing, and he's completely whole. And he comes back to Elisha to offer him gifts of gratitude. He's completely healed. God is greater than our sickness. Elisha remembers how God kept giving him the Syrian army's plans. He kept Israel safe. He kept giving them that information. They would run, they'd be gone, nothing would happen. And the Syrian army gets word of it. And they're angry. They're going to go and they're going to try to shut out the man of God. They find him in Dothan, and the servant goes out and he looks and he sees this army surrounding him. Elisha, they're everywhere. We're surrounded. What are we going to do? We're not going to make it out of here. That thing you thought was going to happen with Elijah is going to happen now. We're going to die. And Elisha, man, he's been doing this for a while now. He probably doesn't even look up. He doesn't look scared at all. He says, fear not. And he prays, Lord, open his eyes. When the servant looks again, he can see the great army of the Lord all around them. God is greater than the things that come against us. And God's greater than the things that we face tonight. That is the true story of Elisha. You know what makes Elisha great is because he realized what he needed was God. He didn't have to be there. All he had to do was obey. When God called, he went. When God spoke, he spoke. And he expected great things. That's what makes Elisha great.